Welcome to A Space to Speak Your Mind,
a radio programme and podcast about mental health and well-being.
Made by people with lived experience in association with Cornwall Mind.
We do occasionally cover subjects that some listeners may find distressing.
For more information, help and support, please visit cornwallmind.org.
A Space to Speak Your Mind with Cornwall Mind for better mental health.
Welcome to the April show.
I'm Dee.
And I'm Victoria.
And we're presenting the show this month.
On the programme,
we'll be learning how tinnitus can affect our mental health with Nick Ray from Tinnitus UK.
We tackle the issue of customer vulnerability with Rifat Tufail from the Phoenix Group.
We'll be finding out about PTSD with Robert Marsh from Veterans Mental Health Charity, Combat Stress.
Sue Christopher from Parkinson's UK will be telling us how more support is needed for those that are affected by insufficient cost of living payments.
Louise Minchin will be explaining why it is so difficult to have a conversation around funeral planning. Now let's hear from Richard talking with Rifat Tufail from the Phoenix Group.
A Space to Speak Your Mind with Cornwall Mind.
The impact of stress and poor mental health on decision-making is well known, with researchers finding that having a scarcity mindset or a feeling of not having enough money can be the equivalent of losing up to 14 IQ points or going without 7 hours of sleep. This can lead to more impulsive decisions, difficulty understanding information, and ultimately poor outcomes for customers if firms are unable to help. Businesses are being asked to take responsibility and support vulnerable customers not to make bad decisions. Whether this is taking out finance, signing up to subscriptions they can't afford, action and support for people is needed and those that are struggling financially. To find out more about this, I'm joined by Rifat Tufail from the Phoenix Group. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Richard. Delighted to be here.
So can you tell me, what is customer vulnerability?
So I always describe it as to be human is to be vulnerable, because we can all be vulnerable at some point in our lives, and we will be. That will be perhaps dealing with a bereavement, or somebody might be challenged with a redundancy or ill health, or financial resilience, which is something that a lot of people are grappling with at the moment through the cost of living crisis. So vulnerability is really broad. There is a more formal definition of vulnerability from the Financial Conduct Authority, which is around somebody who's vulnerable due to their personal circumstances will be especially vulnerable to harm, particularly when a firm is not acting with appropriate levels of care. So basically, in a nutshell, that's the FCA saying to providers and to firms that we need to be prepared to recognise vulnerability and to offer help and support so that customers get good outcomes and they don't face harm.
And from your research, some interesting stats there that you've been finding and how this is affecting people's mental health. So can you explain a little bit more about that for me, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So through research that Phoenix Group have conducted, we've seen that a quarter of UK adults are saying that looking after their money has caused them to lose sleep. And 23% believe that money worries have contributed towards poorer mental health. So all of that can create what you mentioned, a scarcity mindset. Now that's a concept in behavioural science where if you feel like you don't have enough money, then that can be like losing 7 hours of sleep. So you can imagine making a really important financial decision or trying to understand a lot of information when you're in that mindset. So that's why we're trying to raise awareness of the impact that poor mental health can have on some of these behavioural biases.
And also the current situation that we're all facing. How's this affecting our long-term finances? And obviously with those considerations that you've just mentioned there.
Well, the thing is, the UK has an ageing population and people are living longer. I mean, somebody born today is more likely to live to 100 than ever before. And then on top of that, the landscape around pensions, for example, because that's the industry that we're in, life savings, that's a complex landscape. So there's quite a lot for people to have to navigate and to plan for now. And that, again, is one of the reasons why we're really passionate about playing our part, where we're building a society where people have access to the advice and guidance that they need, regardless of their background or their circumstances, and that people are treated with care and compassion when they do need a helping hand.
And you mentioned there, obviously, the elderly. I mean, there are so many people that are vulnerable in our society. So what can be done to help these people?
So what we're doing at the moment is we're investing heavily in how we train our customer service colleagues to make sure that they're well equipped to recognise vulnerability and respond with options and solutions that we've created. We use behavioural science. I mentioned scarcity mindset. mindset. There's also concepts like cognitive overload. So being very aware of breaking information down, sending things in writing, potentially slowing down a conversation so that we can make sure we check understanding. So we built behavioural science into an e-learning we offer all of our colleagues. We also use virtual reality, which is pretty innovative, where we put our colleagues into the shoes of somebody in a very challenging circumstance so that can really empathise with what it's like to disclose a vulnerability. And we also use physical aids to replicate accessibility challenges, which sadly do increase as you get older. And we've challenged ourselves to make sure our websites are also built to the highest accessibility standards as well. So that's some of the ways that we're trying to face into vulnerability and helping our customers.
And I believe you're also bringing together experts from across the financial sector as well as non-profit organisations to support some of the most vulnerable in society.
Yes, so last week in London, we actually held a Phoenix Group Vulnerability Summit. And that was to almost create a coalition across sectors. So that's the private, the charity sector, also some government organisations and organisations like Step Change, Debt Charity, Independent Age, who support the elderly who are in financial hardship. And the Money and Pension Service were also there. Because what we recognise is this needs to be a national conversation and we all need to work together to tackle some of the challenges around people's financial health, which is very closely linked to physical and mental health.
And it's obviously a very important conversation to be having. So if there is someone vulnerable that we are worried about, or if we want to find out more about this kind of topic, is there somewhere that we can go to?
So yes, absolutely. So if anybody's a Phoenix Group customer, we're a family of brands. So that's Standard Life, Sun Life, Reassure, Phoenix Life. Please do reach out to us. As I mentioned, we've trained our customer service representatives to be empathetic and compassionate and to recognise when somebody is in a vulnerable circumstance. So we are here to help. If you are a customer of another provider, please do reach out to them. And there's also other organisations who can support 24/7. So an organisation like the Samaritans, who's our charity partner at the moment.
Rifat Tufail from the Phoenix Group, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Richard. All the best.
A space to speak your mind with Cornwall Mind.
More support is being called upon for the 7.6 million people in the UK living with tinnitus, as 1 in 5 say they have experienced thoughts of self-harm or suicide in the last year alone, while 80% agreed it had led to them experiencing low mood or anxiety. Tinnitus, a condition characterised by hearing sounds such as ringing or buzzing without an external source, affects 1 in 7 adults in the UK. While it can be a temporary annoyance for some, for others it becomes a persistent and distressing companion and can have massive implications on mental health. To find out more about the findings, I'm joined by Nick Ray, who's the Communications Manager for Tinnitus UK. Thanks for being here on the show.
Thank you for having us.
So can you describe the close link between tinnitus and mental health?
Well, we've always known that there seems to be a link between tinnitus and people's emotional well-being. Tinnitus can often be triggered by a change in either people's physical or emotional well-being. So it may, for example, be triggered by a change in their hearing, but it can also be triggered by, for example, going through a period of stress and anxiety. And sometimes it's difficult to unpick whether tinnitus is triggered by the stress or anxiety, or the stress or anxiety is triggering tinnitus. But we have noticed over taking calls to our helpline and with our support services that more and more people are talking about the impact of tinnitus on their mental health. They always have, but it's increasing in numbers. And also, I think the severity of the impact has also increased too.
And I'm just looking at some of the figures. There's a whole host of things that people are reporting. Sleep deprivation is a common side effect. We know from our own well-being that can affect so much of our living and our well-being just by not being able to get some sleep.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I don't get enough sleep, I'm like a grumpy toddler, to be fair. And I think if you're hearing noises, tinnitus can prevent people either falling asleep or when they wake up in the night, their tinnitus seems louder against the background of a quiet environment, because we all live in these nice insulated, almost soundproof rooms these days. So the persistence and sometimes the unpleasant kind of tone that tinnitus can really impact sleep.
I know you mentioned before that there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all as far as how tinnitus comes about, but what are the things that we need to be aware of, and what are sort of the early warning signs?
Well, I think tinnitus is something, it can come out of the blue or it can come from changes. Obviously, we can't prevent aging and age-related hearing loss. You know, if we could turn back time, that would be great. But we can take care of ourselves in loud environments, whether that's doing DIY, whether that is in the garden, whether that's at gigs and concerts, by using hearing protection so that we avoid the risk of losing our hearing through noise exposure. I mean, obviously, the standard tips for general well-being, you know, making sure that you're looking after your mental and your physical health will also reduce the risk. Making sure that, because something as simple as earwax build-up, that can trigger tinnitus, so making sure that your hearing health is looked after. And if you are in your 50s, in the same way that you would go for regular eye tests, go and have regular hearing tests just to make sure that there isn't any deterioration. And if there is, then it can be addressed promptly.
Can you tell me about the support that is available? I noticed from the report there are concerns about how people are getting treatment. So what are the treatments that are available and how do people go about that?
Well, if you are concerned about your tinnitus, then obviously go to your GP, because they can then signpost you on to secondary services. And that is usually based in audiology or ENT departments. I mean, our concerns are that these places are under-resourced, and particularly for specialist interventions such as CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, and other psychological interventions. So we're calling for more specialist services, and to actually make sure that these specialist services are standardised across the country so that everybody has the best possible treatment. But there are things that you can do as well as actually seeing a professional, because a lot of tinnitus management is self-management. So yes, you'll need to see a professional, for example, to get a hearing aid, but things such as sound therapy, relaxation techniques, breathing exercises, they're all kind of things you can do yourself at a low cost. It takes time and perhaps a bit of effort, but we can signpost you at Tinnitus UK to the sort of things that you can do to help yourself.
So I was interested there when you were saying about things like CBT, which we've talked about on the show before, for other things concerning mental health. It really is a case sometimes of learning to cope, especially when we are in those environments where it can become more prominent.
It is absolutely that. And actually the process has a name. It's called habituation. We're using our brain's ability to filter out signals that are of low importance. So all around us, all the time, we are bombarded by sensory information, whether that's what we see, whether that's what we feel, whether that's what we hear. If you live under the flight path of a busy airport, you probably don't notice the sound. I used to live near Gatwick Airport, never really noticed the aeroplanes, but now I live in the Suffolk countryside, I'm very aware of a plane going over, and that's because it's a new and interesting signal to me. When I lived near Gatwick, it wasn't. And that's what we're trying to do with the tinnitus signal. So by encouraging the brain to listen to external sounds, so for example, if you've got a hearing loss, the sound that then comes in via the hearing aid, if you're using background sound or what we call sound therapy, by listening to that signal, you're not listening to the tinnitus. CBT in particular is very good at working with the emotional response that you're having to the sound and actually turning that from a signal of fear and alarm into one of acceptance, maybe even boredom with it, because I mean, nobody's tinnitus is actually saying anything of interest. If you're listening to just something buzzing, that's not giving you anything in any value. So you need to kind of consciously have the brain say, actually, no, I don't need to listen to this.
So what more can we do, and what more needs to be done to improve tinnitus treatment across the UK?
Well, I think it's actually one of the reasons we're doing this is to raise awareness of the number of people who are experiencing the condition and the severity that it can have on their quality of life and, you know, the ongoing costs. I mean, 7.6 million adults in the UK are living with tinnitus, and there's 1 million GP appointments every year for tinnitus. So we're talking a lot of resource and a lot of time. And so we need to kind of make sure that we're directing our resources into supporting this large number of people.
If people are concerned, is there somewhere they can go for more information on what we've been talking about today?
Yeah, we have a very comprehensive website at Tinnitus UK. It's probably the best sort of starting point. And the website is tinnitus.org.uk. And from there, you'll also have connections to our helpline and to our web chat and chatbot services, so you can ask the questions that you want to ask about it.
So people can go to the website for more information there. So thank you so much. That's Nick Ray, who's the Communications Manager for Tinnitus UK. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Richard.
I think there's some really interesting statistics there from Nick around the amount of people that experience tinnitus in the UK, and it's surprising that there aren't that many treatment options. But I think one thing that would be good to raise awareness on is prevention and ongoing ear health. So when I was at uni, I went to lots of gigs and concerts and loved dancing and would probably be right by the speakers every time without using any ear protection. And I feel like there could be a lot more done to kind of raise awareness of how to look after your hearing throughout all stages of your life, because life is pretty noisy, isn't it?
Yes, I agree, it is. I think actually it would be a good idea to start teaching younger children the prevention, because I think these last two generations, they all walk around with earphones in their ears most of the time. And we don't know the music is going straight to them, what volume they're listening to things at.
There is something that I've put on my phone, which is an app, which is a decibel monitor.
Oh, yes.
And it's
yes,
really interesting to just use it at different times in the day. And I've checked it while somebody's given me a lift. And it's amazing how noisy cars actually are. I think it goes up to about 60 decibels. And I think
Really?
a safe decibel is anything under 80. So it's quite surprising that a lot of us drive, a lot of us get into our cars. But, you know, if you have the music on loud, I guess that's only going to add to that. So, yeah, it's things like that everyday noises that can be impacting on our ear health.
Well, I think we obviously we take our ears for granted, and our eyes, etc., etc. I now wear a hearing aid. I've worn one for 5 years. It is such a frustrating experience, because the hearing aid picks up all the background noise, but very little of the relevant noise that I wish to hear.
So really there could be more technology into hearing aids as well, so that it focuses on the noise that you want it to.
But it was interesting what the lady said about earwax. I now have to put drops in my ears every night, which is something I didn't do before. Because when I first went to the doctor to complain about not being able to hear properly, he examined my ears and I had to go and have them syringed, which is now something that the doctors don't do. You have to have it done privately. So I think really ear health should be quite a big thing.
It should be a big topic because there's a lot of awareness on physical health and mental health, and amongst that should definitely be ear health, especially as Nick was saying that tinnitus can really affect your mental health. There's a link there.
This is A Space to Speak Your Mind, and now hear from Sue Christoforou from Parkinson's UK, telling Richard how more support is needed for those that are affected by insufficient cost of living payments.
A Space to Speak Your Mind with Cornwall Mind.
Parkinson's UK is urging the government to increase support for people with Parkinson's as it shines a light on the dire circumstances faced by those individuals due to insufficient cost of living support and systematic failures within the Department for Work and Pensions. The final cost of living payment has been made, but the crisis persists for people with Parkinson's. And I'm joined by Sue Christoforou to find out more. So thank you for being here, Sue.
Thank you, Richard.
Can I first ask, what are the issues that are causing challenges at the moment for those who have Parkinson's?
Well, as you know, we have all been through 2 years of a cost of living crisis, and it's a cost of living crisis that hasn't ended for many, many people with Parkinson's. We found out in our survey in September and October of last year that a significant proportion of people with Parkinson's are struggling with the cost of living. And of those people, 8 out of 10 said that they were reluctant to turn on their heating because they were afraid of unmanageable heating bills. Almost 40% say that they don't have enough to cover basic needs. 1 in 4 are having fewer meals to save money. And half of those people are telling us that their physical and mental health symptoms of Parkinson's are being worsened directly as a consequence of their financial circumstances.
I know quite a few people have been talking about this particular topic, those that have reached out to you. Can you tell me about one instance that has recently come to you?
Yes, I recently spoke to a woman who's living with Parkinson's, and she had a dog grooming business, but because of Parkinson's and its effect on her physical strength and her dexterity, that was no longer a viable business for her. She tried to switch to dog training, but again, because of Parkinson's symptoms, that wasn't viable. So she was left in the position of having to claim universal credit. Now, if one claims universal credit, you might be invited to a work capability assessment, or WCA as it's sometimes known. And as a result of that, if you're found to have limitations because of a health condition in terms of being able to find work, get work and keep work, then you can get a higher rate of universal credit in acknowledgement of the fact that you can't get into the workplace because of your condition. So the person that I spoke to said that she asked her work coach, who was sending her to apply for jobs that were entirely unsuitable, she asked her work coach, do you know anything about Parkinson's and its effect on people's lives? And her work coach responded, no, I know nothing. So that person described to me that prior to her coming to Parkinson's UK for advice, she existed through 2.5 years of misery, to the extent that she contemplated suicide on a number of occasions. And that person's not alone. I recently spoke to somebody and he told me he applied for personal independence payment, or PIP. And again, you have to go through an assessment to determine whether you're eligible for the benefit or not. And he described that experience as traumatizing. To quote him directly, he said he felt like a criminal going through that process. And he was not awarded PIP, and he could have challenged that decision. But he said to me it was just too traumatizing applying in the first place. He couldn't contemplate challenging the decision. He subsequently got PIP because he did ultimately reapply with the support of a friend. But it means that he may well have lost out on hundreds of pounds of support that he should have got prior to the point at which he did start receiving PIP.
It sounds so distressing for those people that you've been talking about. So what are you actually asking the government to do?
Well, we've said to government that the benefit system, the WCA, PIP, is evidently not working for people with Parkinson's. And this is unacceptable because it means that people are not getting the entitlement that is theirs. So the two people I've just spoken about, they didn't receive what they would have received had the relevant assessments been accurately carried out. So people are losing out on significant amounts of money. And as we know, poverty has a negative impact on mental health issues. Avoidable poverty, which is what these people I'm talking about are experiencing, is having a negative impact on the individual's mental health and also their physical health, their physical Parkinson's symptoms, which in turn affects their mental health, which in turn affects their Parkinson's physical symptoms. And so there's a vicious circle that develops as a consequence. So we've said to government, there has to be better training for the people who are making decisions about PIP, who are making decisions about the WCA. And we've also said to government that one of the critical things with people with Parkinson's is the need to adequately heat their homes, because if they're unable to, because they can't afford to, that means, again, their physical symptoms and consequently their mental health symptoms are negatively impacted. And when I say physical symptoms, I mean things like being in severe pain, having muscle rigidity to the extent that you can't move, and at the other end of the spectrum, having muscle spasms such that you can't control your body, which, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, Richard, is distressing. So in addition to saying to government that the people who are making decisions about the benefits that people with Parkinson's get have to know more about the condition. We're also saying to government that they need to fund something called warm home prescriptions, which is a scheme whereby people who have conditions that are sensitive to heat, such as Parkinson's, are identified via the NHS data and provided with support, both with the cost of heating their homes properly, but also with improving the heat efficiency or the energy efficiency of their homes as well. But most critically, having immediate financial support to help with the cost of heating as well. We're also asking government to look again at the WCA, because they have recently proposed changes that would make it even harder for somebody like the woman I mentioned earlier to get the additional funding that they need.
Just looking at the statistics, you're getting so many people calling through at the moment. In the meantime, are there any practical steps that can be taken, or is there support that you can offer?
Yes, Parkinson's UK offers an advice service. So we have local advisors across the UK, and we have a core team of specialist advisors who, when they have people come to them with Parkinson's who've applied for PIP or they've been awarded PIP, but it's a low amount, when they've come to us, the case almost always results in a better outcome from the person with Parkinson's. If they hadn't had PIP, they get PIP. If they had a low amount, they get a higher amount. And that happens in almost 100% of cases. So if there's somebody listening to this who has Parkinson's or knows someone with Parkinson's and they're struggling with the cost of living, with their financial situation, they should get in touch with us, and we'd be more than happy to support them to look at whether there are any benefits they could get, and if so, how they do that, and support them to physically do that process with them.
And there is unclaimed money that people are not getting. So can you explain how that can be given to people?
Absolutely, Richard. In fact, there's an organisation called Policy in Practice who did some recent research, and they found that there is £19 billion worth of benefit that goes unclaimed. And one of the biggest reasons is that people of state pension age and over are not claiming pension credit where they can. Pension credit is a top up to your state pension if you're on a low income. And people often think that they won't be eligible because they own their own home, or they have savings, or they have an employment pension as well as their state pension. But I would urge every single person who's of state pension age and over to check their eligibility for pension credit, because they may well find that they are eligible, and that will just boost their income. But again, as I say, if people need benefit advice, people with Parkinson's need benefit advice, please come to us.
So where can people find out more information?
Well, Richard, people can contact us at Parkinson's UK either by ringing us on our helpline, which is 0808 800 0303. That's 0808 800 0303, or emailing us hello@parkinsons.org.uk, or just having a look at our website, where we have a lot of information on welfare benefits and information on how you contact our advisors. And our website is at parkinsons.org.uk.
And as always, we'll put those in the notes of the podcast. So if people are listening to the radio show, they can go to the podcast and they will get all that information. Sue Christoforou, thank you so much for joining us today here on the show.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
A space to speak your mind with Cornwall Mind.
Now to hear from Louise Minchin explaining why it's so difficult to have a conversation around funeral planning with Richard.
The topic of what's next is often seen as an uncomfortable conversation, whether it's with friends, family, or even work colleagues. But now veteran TV presenter, journalist and author Louise Minchin is urging people to have open conversations about what they are leaving behind and break the negative stigma around talking about planning for the afterlife, following the death of her colleague and former co-host Bill Turnbull, as well as her own husband's battle with cancer. So thank you so much, Louise, for being here today.
Oh, thank you so much. And this is such an interesting conversation to have, but it is not one we have very often, is it?
No, absolutely. And this is why we're breaking the stigma today. So why is it, do you think, that people are shying away around this conversation around death, especially with their friends and family?
Yeah, I mean, why is a good question. So Co-op Funeral Care have done a big report looking at how we feel about talking about death. And yeah, why is it we don't talk about it? First of all, 1 in 10 of us don't discuss death at all with our friends and family. I'm one of the 1 in 10, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But main reasons why we don't talk to people, we're concerned that if we have a conversation about what we want after our death, our funeral wishes, that we're going to worry our family. Also, perhaps we're concerned that we don't have it because people are too busy to talk about it or to listen to you. And also because we're frightened about death and dying. And those are all absolutely, completely understandable. And I was, until last week, literally one of the 1 in 10 that just didn't talk to family about my death, their death, what their plans might be, because I just found it such an awkward conversation to have, but I'm so glad I've had it.
So what was it that made you have that conversation, and how did you go about it?
Well, I think there are better ways of going about it. So I asked my husband, I was just really straight up with him. I've been married 25 years, and in those 25 years, we've never actually, I don't think, as far as I remember, had a serious conversation about our wishes, what we'd like to happen after we died. And so I just said to him, I said, so, what do you want to happen to your body after you've died? I'm not sure he even said that, actually. He just came straight out with it. He said, I want to be cremated. And honestly, I was genuinely shocked, because in the 25 years, I have never asked that. I've never known that. And I completely and utterly have the opposite view, and I want to be buried. And he was really shocked by my reaction. And I just think that is an absolutely key example of why we should have these conversations, because one of the most important things for people who are left behind when they do have funerals for their loved ones is knowing that they're doing the right thing by their husband or wife or whoever it happens to be. And if you don't know the answer, you can't do it. And the answer might not be what you're expecting.
I think as well, because you're then able to plan, aren't you? So if there are particular arrangements that someone wants to make, or particular music or a location, that can be a celebration where you can go, okay, well, let's put that in place. Let's look about how we can actually make that happen.
Exactly. And I think people probably do. Lots of people might have really specific ideas. I mean, I've talked to various people who you might make assumptions that somebody wants a really huge funeral and lots of celebratory songs, and they might actually want the complete opposite. But you're right, there might be a special place for people. There might be, for example, my husband has a very specific place where he'd like his ashes to go. I could have guessed that bit. If I'd known about the cremated thing, I could have guessed with the ashes. And in those difficult days after someone has died, then to know what they want is going to take one of the many, many difficult decisions away from you. It's kind of, for me, it feels a bit like holding their hand once you've gone. Here's the plan. That's what I'd like. Let's do it. So I think it's helpful for everybody.
I think what's interesting is the fact that people that are much younger are having these conversations now. And I wonder if that's a cultural shift, or whether it's just that we're more open as a society now.
I don't know what it is. So I'll give you the stats and then we can talk about it. So it found that a fifth of Brits think about their death every week. So that's a fifth of everyone. With those aged 18 to 29 considering their mortality more often than their older counterparts, with only those 70 plus thinking more about it. So you can understand the 70s plus, time is running out in some ways, isn't it? So they might be thinking about it more. But I was kind of concerned by hearing that from the 18 to 29-year-olds, because we don't have the details, but considering their mortality, I was worried that my children fall into that age group. And I don't want them thinking about their mortality, having concerns, and not talking about it. I really want them to be able to talk about it. So yeah, it may be, I don't know the reasons why they're considering it more, but I just think if we could all have an open conversation, that would be really helpful, because I don't want them feeling worried or scared, because I have a thing that I always think about, that, sometimes in life you have real fears, sometimes you have fears that are not logical. And so I'd love to have that conversation with them to sort of open it up and make them less scared if that's what they are. I mean, I'm guessing, but yeah, it seemed to me really stark, that figure.
You've had that conversation with your husband, but have you had that with your children? And also as far as what they want?
No, and that was really interesting, because one of my daughters was there when we were having this conversation. Her immediate reaction was, don't talk about this. And I was like, no, we need to talk about this. This is exactly why we need to talk about it. So I wouldn't necessarily suggest going the way I went about it, straight in with what's going to happen to your body. I think that everything starts better with a cup of tea. So I would sit down with a cup of tea, and maybe that's what I need to do with my daughters, and just have a gentle conversation, because you could bring it up in lots of different ways. You could say, oh, I've heard it on the radio or whatever. Just, definitely explore, because they don't have to be negative or morbid conversations. They can just be quite moving, actually. I was so glad I know that about my husband now. And there's lots more to know, like what type of funeral, etc. But yeah, these are really good conversations to have.
You're touching up there the kind of places or the way of doing it. I suppose even just going for a walk. But I think what you're saying about the fact that sometimes the conversation is on the television, there's the adverts sometimes that we hear, that's probably a good way in, isn't it? Just to sort of approach the subject there.
Yeah, it's a good start, isn't it? You've got to find your way in, and you can find your way in lots of different ways. I think lots of things make you think about your own mortality, don't they? Perhaps when, you've lost a close friend, or I think the pandemic as well really made it a much more stark conversation, or something people thought about. But choose your moment, I would say. I feel this is really pressing for me at the moment, because my parents are both in their 80s now. And you want to get it right for them, don't you? And you've got to have these conversations before time runs out as well. That's the absolute start reminder, isn't it?
As far as actually a celebration, what are your plans? What would you really like to have?
I want a big party.
I think we all do, don't we?
Some people don't. Some people want to go quietly, and somebody told me today they just want a short funeral. Somebody wants like very formalised one. I think everybody has their own personal thing, and you can't always guess it. I think most people who know my friends would guess that I would like people to have a great party. And the other thing that's been really presses on people's mind, of course, is as well, funerals cost money, and if you go to Co-op Funeral Care, they can help guide you through all sorts of things like that. But lots of people think, no, I just want a cheap funeral. I don't want you to spend lots of money, which you could be spending on other things. So there are so many things to consider, and they're all individual. They'll be individual to the person you're talking to and your family. So just when you can, take a moment to talk about it.
I think that's so good as well, because if you're having that conversation and you had thought about having maybe a lavish, expensive funeral, and then you find out, well, actually, they don't want that. And you think, oh, that's such a relief, because obviously the cost burden can really affect us if we're worried about that in future years. So just knowing exactly what the person wants, and then you can adapt to the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, some people might feel very strongly that they don't want to encumber you with debt, for example. The other thing that came out is that 72% of people hadn't made a will. And I just felt that was a quite high figure, because, again, that has a big impact on your family. If you've not made a will and you haven't said where you wanted to go, then it can have really deep implications. So that's definitely something worth considering. You don't need to have a conversation about that, but actually having made one is a really, really beneficial, in my view, thing to do.
I did see recently there is the thing at the moment that sometimes people actually have, and I can't remember the phrase for it or the name, but not a funeral, but having a celebration while you're still alive. And I think that's an amazing thing, isn't it?
A funeral.
A funeral.
I think it's a funeral. Isn't that a great... That, you see, I like that idea. I think that's a really good idea, because then you can be there, can't you? I mean, it always strikes me when I go to some, I've been to friends' funerals, and I was like, oh my gosh, they'd love this. They'd really love to be here. So that's something you can consider if that's what you want.
And also the point is, if somebody wanted maybe a low-key funeral, you could have that celebration beforehand and they would be able to enjoy that as well. So there's so many different options. Just remind us again where people can find out more about this.
Oh, well, thank you so much for talking about it. The only thing I'd love today is anybody who's listening can go and open up that conversation. Hopefully it will be really helpful. And go to coop.co.uk, and they've got this dedicated website with resources and information to help remove the stigma surrounding death, encourage us to have those much more open conversations about funeral wishes and also later life planning. There's lots of information there that can help.
That's Louise Minchin. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, such a pleasure. Thank you.
A space to speak your mind with Cornwall Mind.
I think I've been quite lucky with regards to funerals. And my mother and my mother-in-law, they'd both planned their own funerals. So that took a great weight off our shoulders at a time when you've lost probably one of the most important people in your life.
How did they approach that? Were they quite philosophical?
Very pragmatic ladies. I think having gone through a war, I'm sure that made a difference to their thinking, and having the experiences, I suppose, that they had of losing people. It must alter your thinking.
I think culturally we see funerals as sad events for us to grieve and think about our loss. But I know that other cultures see them as more a celebration of life and an opportunity to think about enjoyable experiences with that person who have gone. So maybe it's part of our culture that makes it quite challenging in some instances to talk about funeral planning. But like you said, Dee, about your family, if they're being pragmatic about it, and I guess maybe it gave them a sense of control. But yeah, I think there's a new emphasis on an eco-funeral, which involves your body decaying and enriching the soil.
Yes, I suppose.
Which sounds quite an interesting way to think about how you contribute after death to planet Earth in a positive way.
It's a bit like continuing, isn't it? So you would go on, you would enrich the soil and the flowers that were there and things like that. That's a good way of looking at it, I think.
Yeah, so in a way, it's, I guess in a humorous way, we talk about the kind of songs that we'll have at our funeral. And my mum and obviously it's just my mum's opinion, really doesn't like Enya. So to wind her up, we always say, Mum, we're going to play Enya at your funeral. And she says, well, if you do that, I'm coming back to haunt you. But that's something that we do talk about a lot, is the music that we want at our funeral. And I don't know whether that says something about us as a family and our relationship to music, or as a culture, how we all have a song that feels connected to us and something that we'd like people to remember us by. And I suppose music's quite evocative in that sense. And yeah, I think that's something that is really important to talk about. What music would you like to have at your funeral? And I used to dance with a dance troupe in Bristol called the Flaming Feathers, and they were actually booked to dance at someone's funeral to do a flash mob. And this was a funeral for a local woman who planned her own funeral. She passed of cancer, and she wanted more fun and humour at her funeral, so she wanted them to do a flash mob to Another One Bites the Dust.
Oh, brilliant.
Really brilliant, yeah. Which,
that's great.
So what we were saying earlier about funerals being seen as a sad event, she decided to completely turn that on its head and have fun and get everybody to remember the fun and, you know, humourful woman that she was. And it had a huge impact on the people that went to the funeral, but also somebody took a video, and that video then went viral, and it opened up a huge discussion about, should we be thinking more about our own funerals, and should they be more of a fun celebration than mourning and sadness? I suppose it feels like a very sensitive topic, but an important one.
Of course.
And if somebody does contribute to their own funeral planning, it gives them an element of control.
A space to speak your mind with Cornwall Mind.
This is a space to speak your mind, and time to hear from Robert Marsh from Veterans Mental Health Charity, Combat Stress, talking about PTSD.
A third of people asked say they don't understand PTSD and its symptoms, and although 2/3 of us are thankful to British military veterans for their service, just a quarter believe veterans are shown enough appreciation. Charity Combat Stress raise funds for life-changing mental health treatment for veterans, and Robert Marsh is here to tell me more about what they do. So thank you for being here, Robert.
Richard, it's great to be with you. Thank you for having me on.
Can you explain about PTSD as experienced by veterans and also some of the misconceptions around it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. PTSD in the military context for many veterans is as a result of multiple traumas. So it's not one episode. It's not like a car crash or any other sort of awful experience in civilian life. You know, if you go on an operational tour, you're away for 6 months as a minimum, sometimes a year. And some of the things that veterans experience, certainly in terms of symptoms, are things like flashbacks, nightmares, avoiding anything that reminds you of the trauma, in particular things like smells. There's one veteran who just cannot stand the smell of barbecues because of his work clearing up charred bodies on the Basra Road, but also difficulty with sleep and feeling constantly anxious. And then the other thing is this sort of sense of hypervigilance, always being switched on, ready for action, almost leading your life in a very sort of soldierly way. And that will manifest itself by walking down the street and looking at rooftops for snipers or looking for tripwires, or when you go into a building, making an observation of where all the exits are and making sure that your back is close to a wall so that you can observe. And that way of living your life in that sort of hypervigilant state, fight or flight, must be exhausting, if not actually quite frightening. So certainly in the veteran context, added to that is we look after predominantly male veterans. It's changing, but predominantly male veterans, and men are not natural help seekers, and the military male is even worse. And like any other medical condition, the sooner you try and get some help, the better the prognosis. So the message really is that if you are a veteran or you know somebody who's a veteran and they're struggling, please do try and get in touch. And there are lots and lots of resources on our website, which is combatstress.org.uk, self-help resources, which people have found very, very effective. But there's also our helpline, which is 0800 138 1619, and that's manned by trained counsellors, so that the help sort of starts there. And it is no shame to reach out for help. In fact, actually, often it's the most courageous step is to say that you need help.
It's interesting you were saying there about the timescale of when people seek help, because it's not necessarily an immediate thing. Some people find these symptoms over a longer period of time. So it's almost once they've acclimatised back into civilian life that some of these things start rearing their head.
That's right. And actually, when we see TV and programmes and films that depict PTSD, because they can't really explore it to its fullest extent, it's not really faithful to what veterans experience. And often, veterans don't really start experiencing problems until years afterwards. As I've said, on average, veterans come to us a decade plus after they've left the armed services, by which time most of the things that you and I would rely upon for what most people would consider a normal life, so friends, family, marriage, a home, a job, have often withered away. And then it's much more difficult to get somebody back on an even keel.
And you talked there about the depiction in movies and films. Do you think that is why the public are unaware of the mental health challenges veterans face, or do you think there's other elements to it as well?
Well, I think it's partly that, but it's also that the armed services, certainly the regular armed services, are so small now that most people don't interact with somebody in the armed services in their day-to-day life or meet a serving member of the armed forces at all. So it's clear from our research that many don't understand the severity of military-related or combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder and how it develops. That's certainly one of the challenges.
And as far as you're saying there for people to seek support, can you just tell me a bit about combat stress and how they support veterans, especially around the subject of PTSD?
Well, you've already mentioned that we deliver life-changing treatment, but actually you could almost argue that a lot of it is life-saving. There's a veteran testimony that I read the other day. This chap said that he was so genuinely grateful to combat stress. If it wasn't for them, he was 100% sure that he would have taken his own life. And once he started treatment, he could see the light at the end of the tunnel, and that you go from darkness to a ray of sunshine, and most importantly, it gave him hope. So we offer treatment on the more complex end of PTSD. So there is a diagnosis of complex PTSD, CPTSD, or PTSD with other comorbidities, so anxiety and depression. But we employ clinicians, psychologists, psychiatrists, nurses, occupational therapists, art therapy. We run a peer support network and a family support network too. So there is no one size fits all. What often happens is a bespoke treatment is given to a particular veteran. But in terms of numbers, we reckon that we help about 12,500 veterans every year through the helpline and our online resources. And then those that would go through a full clinical screening would then be plugged into one of our intensive programs.
And just remind us again where people can go for more information on this topic.
So if you're a veteran and you need some help, the best way is through the helpline, which is 0800 138 1619. And then, of course, our website, which is combatstress.org.uk. And there are lots of self-help resources on there. So things around anger management, around bereavement, those sorts of things.
Thank you so much. That's Robert Marsh from the charity Combat Stress. Thank you for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me, Richard.
A space to speak your mind.
The NHS is raising awareness of OpCourage, the Veterans Mental Health and Wellbeing Service. This comes as a survey of over 3,000 veterans and serving personnel carried out by NHS England found that the majority of those who took part said they found it difficult to ask for help regarding mental health issues. Joining me now to tell me more is Dr. Jonathan Leach, OBE, who's the NHS England Associate Medical Director for Armed Forces Veterans Health, and former member of the Armed Forces, Nigel. So thanks to both of you for being here.
Hello.
Can I start with you, Dr. Jonathan? Can you tell me about the OpCourage service?
Yeah, so this is a service we've been building over recent years. It's specifically designated for military veterans, both regulars and those who've been in the reserve forces. And the feedback we had was that, as you just described, people have difficulty coming forward. Sometimes it's because they've got complicated lives, which I'll come back to, but also they want to see somebody who understands them. You know, there was a lot of feedback that these civvies, to use the term, they won't understand me. They won't understand what I've been through. So OpCourage is designed, and it's right across England, is designed to provide more specific and designated support for veterans. The key things here are that you can self-refer. You don't need a GP referral. And in fact, of about 60% of our referrals into OpCourage are by the individual themselves, a spouse or partner, or often by other charities or other support groups. So 60%. And then actually you get seen and assessed by people who understand the military. They get it. So you don't need to explain what a Sergeant Major is. You don't need to explain what a Chief Petty Officer is. They understand what the rank structure means, what that means for your mental health. I suppose the other way round to this is that this is for those who have mental health difficulties. But I also need to say that the vast majority of veterans don't have mental health difficulties. They're brilliant members of society and they bring the skills, experience, knowledge, expertise, work ethic into a civilian life and actually can be brilliant employees. So whilst obviously these services are there for those who need help, and that's absolutely right, we also mustn't take away from the fact that the vast majority of veterans actually, maybe transition can be difficult, but they actually settle and can be really good members of society.
Can you explain a little bit about the actual support that you provide, how that works?
Yeah, so what happens is, given very tight timelines in terms of when people should be assessed, you get assessed often by a senior nurse or therapist. They will supply things like support, treatment for anxiety, depression, alcohol, substance misuse, PTSD. But one of the key elements is also looking at some of the wider determinants of health. So if we, for example, use one of the examples of a housing charity, this is the London one, but it ranges across the country. They have a partner with a housing charity which helps with housing, as it said. So if somebody's struggling with that, then they can refer on. In the Southwest, there's, for example, a partnership with Walking with the Wounded. Walking with the Wounded is a national, very creditable charity that has funding from the NHS through this. And they will help that person in terms of getting a CV together, how they can be supported to apply for and get employment, as well as the peer support elements. And, I think Nigel will probably talk about how important it is sometimes about having like-minded people around you who understand what you've been through, and actually if they've been through it before themselves, how they can help. So it's a wide range of things. And then finally, Op Courage will supply some of the more detailed and intensive treatments. I've just been involved this weekend with somebody who sadly was trying to take their life last week. This patient is currently an inpatient in hospital. Op Courage is actually coming into the hospital, supporting them. And as this patient is discharged, they will be picking up that to make sure that the individual is kept safe and actually the therapy and treatments that they require are actually provided.
Such an important service, and as you were saying there, I mean, it is almost a lifeline for some. So if I could bring Nigel in now, can you tell me a bit about your experience after leaving the armed forces?
Yeah, so I have done just over 12 years within the army. I left, became a prison officer within the prison service, had a very good career, and some years after, I left the prison service due to a medical issue, which wasn't related to this. And unfortunately, after 3 things happened in my life, I had a breakdown in my mental health through service. And basically, I was supported by the NHS. I've had top-up therapy through Op Courage, which I'm a massive believer of. And I do on a regular basis share this with my peers and the service colleagues who are struggling, that Op Courage is out there and it's there to benefit anyone who's been in the military. And then, as was just said by Jonathan, it's a peer support. I've wore a uniform the same as someone in the RAF or the Navy, and actually, excuse the pun, but we're all brothers in arms. And actually, if we can help each other, why wouldn't we?
Yeah, I think that's so important, isn't it, to have those people that have had those experiences and to be able to talk openly. And I know in your own personal life, you've sort of set up your own organisation. You're helping people in your own community, aren't you?
Yeah, and it's through my journey. I still have wobbles, very, very clearly. I'm very open about it. On a weekly basis, sometimes things happen, but I've now got the tools within the kit, excuse the pun, to try and get to the next day better and healthier. But yeah, I've set up a project called Combat to Coffee, which is a veterans and families outreach project, and it's really basic. I learned this going through some of the treatment myself. Coffee makes conversation, and actually if we can use that as a vehicle to get people help and link into Op Courage, why wouldn't we do it?
I think the other thing here is that you just mentioned about sometimes people use top-ups, just with the slings and arrows of life. And it's not a military case, but if I just use this as an example, one of my patients was involved in a terrible car crash and was cut out of the car and developed PTSD, was successfully treated and went back to work. And then the following year, she was going down the same road and saw somebody else being cut out of a car in exactly the same place. And it just brought everything back. And then she was really worried that, she was going to lose her job and everything else. And I said to her, no, it's just brought everything back. And treatments can still be, as were with her, really successful. And so actually with the slings and arrows of life, and that's just one example, sometimes people do need to come back for more help. And actually we're very clear that, this isn't a once only. We will try and discharge people because we need to make space for other patients, but actually they can come back if they subsequently find that they need further help.
I think it's having that safety net, isn't it? It's knowing that there is someone there. And I guess, we all have challenges in our lives, but especially if you have come from an army background and you are a veteran that have experienced so much in your life, that you will have certain points in your life and things that in civilian life yourself that will bring back or will enhance experiences that you've had before. So just knowing that you can reach out as and when you need to, I think that is so important.
Yeah, I think that's really important because you've mentioned trauma from the armed forces. I've diagnosed clinically with PTSD. Trauma's in the eye of the individual, so it doesn't matter if you're Civvy Street have injured yourself, it's trauma is to that person. And I think for me, knowing that the book isn't closed, the key's in the title post. Of course I want to go back to where I was prior to being diagnosed with PTSD, but sometimes triggers just in general life causes me anxiety. Knowing that I can go back, as Jonathan has said, self-refer, get picked up by someone within our team who maybe even make a referral for me is really important because I've got a mechanism which can help me if I need it. And that, for me, has probably helped me grow as a person as well.
We know that, for example, there are things which can make things worse. So Remembrance Day is an obvious one, and we see that. But, for example, we had an increase in referrals around when the military moved out of Afghanistan. People, either those who served in Afghanistan or those who previously served, it made it a more difficult time for them and very reflective. Why did I do this? I lost my friends. Was it worth it? Am I worth it? So we did see an uptick, and certainly in my GP practice, we had a number of patients who came in and found it a really difficult time. And so we need to be alive to some of these events and anniversaries because they can be really difficult times in people's lives.
So if someone's listening to this and they're hearing what you're saying and they're thinking that they need the support that you're offering, can you tell them how they can access Op Courage?
So the easiest way is through the NHS website. So using Google, whichever is your favourite search engine, just put in Op Courage. And I looked this morning, it comes up first. If you want to go direct, you could use all the W's, nhs.uk/Op Courage. That website also includes, for example, details of the physical health pathway. We haven't talked about physical health, but the interrelationship between physical health and mental health is really important. That's Op Restore. But it also includes, for example, details where, for example, we've been encouraging GPs to become GP accredited, and there are just over 3,000 GP surgeries, quite a number in the Southwest, for example, where you have a clinical lead who has a deeper understanding of the needs of the military. So all those details are on that website.
Yeah, I think if people are struggling, they're ex-military, please use the service. It does help. It's helped me. Indirectly, me getting help has helped my family because they're the ones who suffer at the end of the day. When my relationship broke down and my kids were the ones who suffered. And I know Jonathan's just mentioned different ways of accessing Op Courage. And I will put it as a pitch. Combat to Coffee has a direct link to Op Courage straight away. So you've only got to push one button. Please use it. And if anyone wants to reach out to me, fill your boots, as they say in the military. We're easy to find. We'll come back to someone, and don't be scared of getting some help.
Thank you so much. That's Nigel, former member of the Armed Forces, and Dr. Jonathan Leach, OBE, who's the NHS England Associate Medical Director for Armed Forces Veterans Health.
That's all for this month's show.
Thanks for listening, and we look forward to you joining us for the May show.
If you missed anything on today's show, you can download the podcast right now on Apple, Spotify and Amazon Podcasts.
For support and more information for better mental health, visit coolmoremind.org or call the Mind Helpline during office hours on 0300 123 3393.
There is a 24/7 NHS local urgent mental health response phone line. It's free to access by anyone, any age, on 0800 038 5300.
And don't forget, you can call the Samaritans anytime for free on 116 123.
If you'd like to be a part of the show, you can get in contact. Just email aspacetospeakyourmind@gmail.com.
And you can also find out more about the show if you follow Cornwall Mind on Facebook or Instagram, or on their website, cornwallmind.org.